We're going to talk here about the US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. And this idea of reserve currencies, it goes way back. It goes back to the 6th century Greek Empire. And on a long enough timeline, sure, world orders, they come and go, currencies come and go. But this Athenian owl is a great example of the first reserve currency, and it shows that not all currencies go up in flames with each new world order. To be fair, though, those flames have to get pretty hot to melt silver. So I'm going to start this one off where I left off on the last. We were talking about the death of the dollar, talking about de-dollarization, and how that applies to gold ownership, because that's what this channel is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it might mean for the wider economy. Now, clearly, I can't tell you what's going to happen with gold, with stocks, with the dollar itself, but I can lay out the reasons that I'm doing what I do. We can also look at history. We can compare, we can contrast, and we can start to differentiate. We can focus on probable outcomes rather than getting up in these shocking possible outcomes. Separate the signal from the noise. Getting to the probable, that's the important part here, and it's also the difficult part. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but YouTube rewards sensationalism. The most shocking story gets the most attention. People are literally incentivized to say crazy things. The end is near. That used to be the message the stereotypical Hollywood crazy person would wear on a sandwich board. Now it's kind of a core tenet of popular stories here. Content creators have discovered that the message plays really well to viewers who already have that nagging concern about a larger issue. It feeds off a basic anxiety, pumps up views. Now, if the end is near, well, it's an incredibly unlikely surprise event that, of course, nobody can predict. But because it has proven to be such an effective hook, it's become the Konami cheat code of YouTube. Up, up, down, down, left, right, BA start. So we're not here to talk about late 80s video games. We're here to talk about de-dollarization, the forfeiture of the US dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency. Now, the shocking take on the topic is that the end is near. We're all witnessing the death of the dollar in real time. Some say it's so near that we don't even have to pick a number of years. It's just June or something similarly shocking. Now, if we're looking for common ground between my take on the subject and those shocking truths that you won't believe, it's that the dollar's dominance has been on a decline, and the influence of the United States has been eroding in parts of the world, maybe everywhere in the world, but to varying degrees. And the way that you'll most likely be affected is the part that doesn't line up. If you're trying to plan for a gradual decline in the value of the dollar, well, you would take different actions than you would if you were expecting hyperinflation to take the value of the dollar to zero later this year. So let's start with the history. The US dollar has been the primary medium of exchange and the base peg of value for international currencies since Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. And then unofficially, a little bit further back, as far back as the 1920s, the US dollar became the world's dominant reserve currency because of the power, because of the influence of the US at the time. The country was wealthy, the dollar was stable, and the US had the most powerful military in the world. The initial popularity of the dollar was also propped up by the gold standard of the time and the amount of gold the US had. In the 1920s, an ounce of gold was $20.67. 1944, price of an ounce of gold was set to $35. Even though the gold standard was somewhat abandoned, the US dollar was still backed by an enormous gold reserve. The Bretton Woods Agreement is what led to the idea of a foreign exchange reserve that central banks used almost exclusively for international trade and finance. And fast forward 30 years to 1974, we had an agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia that created the petrodollar. That led to oil-producing countries pricing their exports in US dollars, which meant that if you wanted oil, you had to have dollars. Prior to the dollar's world reserve currency status, it was the Great Britain pound that was the dominant currency. British Empire was the big player at the time. The pound was officially pegged to gold beginning in 1816, and London was the center of the world's financial markets. French franc, also another major currency at the time. Prior to that, it was the Dutch guilder in the 17th and 18th century, another currency backed by gold and silver. And prior to that, it was the Spanish peso in the 16th and 17th century. Now, the peso wasn't just backed by gold and silver, it was gold and silver. And I made a short about the origin of Spain's gold and silver, what propelled them into their position as the world's dominant economy of the time, and I'll link to that in the description if you're interested. And like I mentioned in the opening, the changing world reserve currencies, they can all be traced back to this guy, this Athenian owl, the Greek silver drachma. This Athenian tetradrachm, by the way, this was the most widely used currency of the 6th century. And it's typically credited as the standard for international trade because it was a consistent 17 grams of pure silver. And that idea that everyone trusted the Athenian coins at the time, it led to two different ideas. The first was just a consistent unit of coinage, regardless of what was stamped on it. And the second was this reserve currency idea. Since you could use them outside of Greece, everybody trusted the coinage. And that usage is really what led to the idea of a world reserve currency. So let's do a 180, come back to present time. There's a guy named Ray Dalio, maybe you've heard of him. He has made the point that the world reserve currency dominance tends to last about 100 years. And that observation has really struck a chord around here. If we were to say the US dollar has been the dominant reserve currency since the 1920s, and we use Ray Dalio's observation as a rule, well then the US dollar is at the end of its term. It's time for a new world order. And normally, I would just breeze by that point because there's simply no term limit on a world reserve currency. The idea makes no sense. It's simply a loose pattern that occurred in the transition from the Spanish Empire to the Dutch Republic to the British Empire. Something we could infer from history, though, is that the changing world order did not send the prior dominant country into collapse. Spain and the Netherlands and the UK, they are all still alive and kicking. Now, if you wanted to look at a currency crisis in one of those countries, you can come back to maybe 1992. If you'd like more information on the event, look into Black Wednesday. I'm not going to give you the full history, but the quick overview is that the pound lost nearly 15% of its value against the Deutschmark almost overnight. That led to the UK government withdrawing from the European exchange. That was clearly a big deal for the British pound, but it occurred nearly 50 years after losing its reserve status. Now, the reason for the history there is to demonstrate that reserve currency dominance changes over time. Each New World Order does not drink the prior empire's milkshake. When I made that point offhand on my last video, well, several commenters noted that the US debt is far beyond the UK's debt in the 1920s or 1944, whichever you'd like to use as the handoff point, and that is true. If you were to compare an economy from 2022 to an economy in 1944, well, they will be exponentially different. And so will the GDP of each country. If you look at UK's debt in 1944 as a percentage of its GDP, we can compare that. Their debt in 1944 was 250% of their GDP. The current US debt is 122% of GDP, so that's just under half the debt ratio of the UK at the time. So everything's fine, don't worry about it, just go about your business. Nah, that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm trying to do is just dispel one of the major myths on the topic. And it's simply that losing world reserve currency does not automatically mean immediate hyperinflation, regardless of whether or not the country has debt. Now, if we're going to use Ray Dalio's history to reference past eras of world orders, we're going to use it to look at the impact of those changes as well. We can even use his own takes on the matter. Now, first of all, Ray says over and over that he's not a fatalist. He talks about a decline over time, even specifically says that the worst case doesn't affect most people as badly as it might seem. He's quoted in the New York Times saying that if you worry, you don't have to worry. And I like that. It's exactly what we're doing here. You put that together with a statement about worst cases not being as bad as they might seem, and you can swap the word worry with plan. Now, this is not about Ray Dalio. This is about practical planning, but it does line up. So put all of this together, and I think it makes a simple basis for planning. It's the case that I'm building off of a fading value in USD. I'm not worried about losing world reserve currency status because it doesn't mean hyperinflation, total collapse of the dollar. It means an eventual decline. And the reason I say I'm not worried is that I know eventually it will happen. I'm planning around it. Now, I do not study Ray Dalio, but he also mentioned the idea of a 4, 5, or 7% loss of value per year to the US dollar. US citizens would think that their savings are fine because really there's nothing to compare the dollar to. They're just thinking in terms of nominal value. Now, what I try to do myself is build up assets that won't fade away in value. Real estate, certain stocks, gold, maybe even Bitcoin. Hard to say, but my plan is to get into these assets when the price is low. And I can do that because I know I'm not racing a June event. I'm not buying into the general FOMO that's being pushed over and over by armchair analysts. Now, I'm breaking this into two parts because there are really two interconnected transitions in play. The first is what I'm talking about right now, dollar's eventual demise, gradual downward slide, and how to plan in a way to preserve what you've worked for. The second, it's happening at the same time, it's the gradual rise of competition, the yin to our yang. And with all of the noise about Russia, sometimes it's just hard to focus in on what's really going on. The rising superpower is definitely not Russia. Russia's not a superpower. The rising force is China. Now, the US is still decades ahead of China in a lot of ways. It's behind in others. But several analysts, they predict a flip at the top of the GDP list from US to China by 2033. And everything the US or China is doing right now on the world stage seems to be done strategically to counter the other. Now, that part, it's going to have to be part two. And if you thought that the first part has felt overly optimistic, well, unfortunately, part two might balance that out a little bit. So to wrap up the first part, I really like Dalio's quote that if you worry, you don't have to worry, because we're actively tuned in, though. We're going to change that wording. We're going to say, if you plan, then you don't have to worry as much. Now, what would we do if we wanted to protect against a 5% annual slide in the dollar? What would we do if we want to help create a safety net for ourselves in retirement, for our kids and future generations? I've talked about my plans for hitting short-term goals, stretch goals, long-term goals for gold positions. I think it's smart to start with a non-zero position in gold. Work up to 3 ounces, extend that to 12, to 24, to 50, to 100. More, but do that as it's feasible to you. And all the while, at least personally, I've tried to stay diversified. Like I said, I'm not a financial advisor, but that's what I'm up to. I've been buying gold for 15 years, making scheduled gold purchases for 8. And that means that it's never been especially painful at any one time. I've done my best to stay diversified along that route as well. I'm trying to focus on what I can control rather than worrying about what I cannot. Keep an eye open for part two. It's going to be coming soon. We're going to look into the influence of trade deals, the potential impact of BRICS nations, and China specifically. Now, if you live in a Western-aligned country or you simply have dollar-denominated interests, part two is every bit as important as part one, maybe even more so. Now, I'm approaching this without the hype, without the politics. This is about practical ways to create backup plans, to avoid the crazy stories, the FOMO, and again, just focusing on what we actually can control. So let us know where you stand, what you're doing with your gold, with your other assets, and whether or not you worry enough to not have to worry. Let us know. And while you're in the comments, be sure to hit the like button if you found any of this interesting. Be sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on if you'd like to see more on the topic. And if you're still here, thanks again for watching. I always appreciate your time. Take care.